Hi everyone, it's Miss H, and today we're going to be looking at acids and bases. So let's start off with some properties of acids. Acids give off hydrogen ions or hydronium ions, depending on who you ask. In physical science, we generally go with hydrogen ions. So this would be an H plus ion. They have a pH of 6 or less. So we'll talk more about the pH scale in just a minute, but it ranges from 0 to 14, and the lower end of that pH scale is the acids. They taste sour. So if you think about a lemon is a really good example of something that is acidic. So lemons have a sour taste. They also tend to feel sticky. So if you've ever felt lemon juice as it started to dry, it starts feeling really sticky. That's kind of in general how acids kind of feel. Some other information about acids. They are capable of corroding metals. So when acids come into contact with metals, they break them apart. They break them down and they cause them to oxidize or do something else where it breaks down. How do we know that an acid is what we have? Because we don't like to go around tasting things in a lab, so we have some other indicators that we can use. We have universal indicator paper, which gives us the pH value. Then we have litmus paper. Litmus paper is a type of paper that will react to acids and bases. In the case of an acid, it will turn red. So we have red litmus paper, blue litmus paper, and neutral litmus paper. All three of those will turn or remain red in the presence of acids. Phenolphthalein is specifically a base indicator. It's a liquid that gets added to a sample, and if it contains an acid, there won't be any change. It'll stay clear or whatever color it was. It might turn slightly milky, slightly not quite clear anymore, but it won't change colors. Some other examples of acids. So as I said, you have lemon juice as an example. Vinegar is another example, along with tomato juice, black coffee, soda, urine, and saliva. Okay. Bases produce hydroxide ions. So more hydroxide is a polyatomic ion, which is OH, and it has a -1 charge. They have a pH of 8 or more, so between 8 and 14. Bases tend to taste bitter. Now, this is a little harder for us to think of an example for, because most things that are bitter are toxic, so we don't eat a lot of bitter foods. But a good example would be if you've ever had soap or shampoo get in your mouth when you've been taking a shower. Those are going to have a very bitter taste to them. Sometimes almonds or broccoli will also have a bitter taste to them, but it's a little harder to identify there. Bases tend to feel very slippery. So again, think about that wet soap. That's a base. Bases are also called alkaline. They usually are going to contain one of the alkaline metals or the alkali metals in their compound along with that hydroxide. For our bases, again, we can use the universal indicator that'll tell us that it's 8 or more. We can use our litmus paper. It will turn blue or remain blue in the presence of bases. So again, red, neutral, or blue litmus paper will either turn blue or remain blue in the presence of a base. Phenolphthalein will turn into this bright, very bright pink. And sometimes it turns more of a red color depending on the exact concentration of the phenolphthalein, but typically it's going to be a very pink color. And the stronger the base, the brighter the pink. And weaker bases are going to be a paler pink. Examples of bases include seawater, baking soda, soap, bleach, ammonia, and drain cleaner. One good thing to help you kind of figure out if something is an acid or a base, if you don't know the pH value, the taste, the feel, the indicators, any of that kind of stuff, generally, most of the time, if it's edible, it's probably an acid. And if it's a cleaning product, it's probably a base. Now, again, this is not always the case. We know that we can eat baking soda in things like breads and that sort of thing. And we know that there are some acids we don't want to consume, like battery acid. But in general, that's kind of a safe bet for the majority of substances that you're going to encounter in a physical science class. Now you'll notice that when I was going over the pH values for acids and bases, I skipped over the number 7. 7 is a neutral compound. So this means that they produce equal numbers of hydrogen and hydroxide ions. So if we look at pure water, H2O, we can rewrite that as HOH, which breaks down into a hydrogen ion and a hydroxide ion. And because they're found in equal concentrations, that makes it a neutral compound. So if we look at the pH scale, what does it actually measure? So we've talked about pH, and most of us are familiar with what pH is, but we don't really understand what it really means. So the pH scale measures the concentration of hydrogen ions. So the more hydrogen ions it has, the lower the pH is. And this seems kind of weird to us, and it's because of how the particular scale works. It's a logarithm-based or a natural log-based scale. And so it actually has kind of that inverse relationship where the more the concentration is, the lower the number will be. It is a log-based scale, which means that each value is 10 different than the next one. So a pH of 5 is 10 times more acidic than a pH of 6. And a pH of 5 would be 100 times more acidic than a 7 and 1,000 times more acidic than an 8. You could also go the other way around. An 8 is 10 times less acidic than a 7, 100 times less acidic than a 6, etc. There is also a pOH scale that measures hydroxide ion concentration, and it is also a log-based scale, with each value being 10 different. It is the exact opposite of the pH scale, but that's not really something we get into in a physical science class. This just shows you a picture of what a pH scale looks like. So from 0 to 6 is an acid, 7 is neutral, and from 8 to 14 is a base. So you can see that from 0 to 6, you have more hydrogen ions than you do hydroxide ions. At 7, they're equal numbers. And from 8 to 14, you have more hydroxide ions than you do hydrogen ions. And the farther you get away from that 7, the stronger the acid or the base is. So 0 and 14 are your strongest acids and your strongest bases. And 6 and 8 are your weakest acids and your weakest bases. The last thing we want to look at with acids and bases are what's called an acid-base neutralization reaction. So if you recall from the previous unit, we talked about double replacement reactions. So an acid-base neutralization reaction is just a special type of double replacement reaction. This occurs when you have an acid and a base reacted together. So you add an acid and a base together, and the results are pure water, H2O or HOH, and a neutral compound that we refer to as a salt. Now, keep in mind that in chemistry, salt doesn't necessarily mean the stuff that sits on your kitchen table that you use to put on your French fries or that sort of thing. Sodium chloride, NaCl, that salt that's on your kitchen table is only one type of salt. In a chemical sense, a salt is an ionic compound that could result from an acid-base neutralization reaction. So let's take a look at some examples and identify our acids, bases, water, and neutral salt. So here we have 1 HCl plus 1 NaOH yields 1 H2O and 1 NaCl. So our acid here, acids will always start with hydrogen because, again, they give off hydrogen ions. Bases will always end with hydroxide, OH. Again, they give off hydroxide ions. Water will either be H2O or HOH, and our neutral salt will not contain either H nor OH. It will not have either one of those. It's important to remember that your reactants will always be the acid and the base, although the order could be flipped, and your products will always be water and a neutral salt. So here we have 1 CaOH2 plus 1 H2CO3 yields 1 CaCO3 plus 2 HOH. So if we look, we can identify our acid starts with hydrogen, our base ends with hydroxide, our water is always either going to be H2O or HOH, and our neutral salt doesn't have either one, either the H or the OH. Next example we have here is 1 H2SO4 plus 2 NH4OH yields 2 HOH plus 1 NH42SO4. Again, acids are always going to start with hydrogen. Bases are always going to end with hydroxide. Water will always be H2O or HOH. And our neutral salt will not have hydrogen or hydroxide as the first or last thing. So you'll notice that this does have the H in it for the ammonium, but it is not by itself. It is attached to that N, and that's what prevents it from being hydrogen or hydroxide ions. Because remember that NH4 will act as its polyatomic ion, so it'll act as one thing. So hopefully this helps you better understand acids and bases and acid-base neutralization reactions.